Dr. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the bustling hospital floor. Her heart pounding in rhythm with the echoing footsteps of nurses and the urgent beeping of medical equipment. A young, ambitious physician. Dr. Carter had always dreamt of making a difference in the lives of her patients. Each day, she donned her white coat not just as a uniform, but as a symbol of her commitment to care, compassion, and the sacred trust bestowed upon her by those who sought her help. But that day, as she moved through the crowded ward, an unsettling feeling tugged at her gut, a sense that the very foundation of her ideals was about to be challenged. It began with a routine examination. During her rounds, Dr. Carter noticed an elderly patient named Mrs. Thompson, who was always eager to share stories about her grandchildren. However, today was different. Mrs. Thompson's eyes were clouded with confusion, and her frail hands trembled as she reached for Emily's. "Doctor, I've been feeling strange lately. I don't feel like myself," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, concerned. Dr. Carter reviewed Mrs. Thompson's medical records, only to discover an unusual notation suggesting that she had been enrolled in a clinical trial for a new medication, without her knowledge or consent. Unable to shake the feeling of unease, Emily began to dig deeper. In the following days, she scrutinized the records of other patients, uncovering a disturbing pattern. A significant number of her patients bore similar notations, all pointing to their unwitting participation in clinical trials that had been conducted under the radar of ethical oversight. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her conscience. Dr. Carter felt the walls closing in. She was confronted by a deeply troubling moral dilemma. On one hand, she understood the importance of clinical trials in advancing medicine and discovering breakthrough therapies. Yet, on the other, ethical considerations loomed large. Was it justifiable to sacrifice patient autonomy for the sake of medical progress? The reality it painted was stark and disconcerting. Her patients were being treated as experimental subjects rather than as individuals deserving of informed consent and dignity. As she wandered the sterile halls, Emily couldn't shake off the feeling of betrayal that unfurled within her. The hospital, once viewed through the lens of hope, transformed into a labyrinth of shadows where ethics were overlooked, and patients became mere statistics. Her thoughts raced as she grappled with the implications of her discovery. Would she become a whistleblower, risking her career and the trust of her superiors for the sake of her patients? Or should she turn a blind eye, continuing on the path paved by her predecessors? That evening, Dr. Carter sat alone in her small apartment, the city's skyline glowing faintly outside her window. The vibrant colors of life beyond the glass contrasted sharply with the weight of decision pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar resolve creep back in. As a physician, she had sworn an oath to protect her patients. The faint murmur of her own conscience echoed in her mind, urging her to act. In that defining moment, Emily realized she could no longer ignore the haunting truth unraveling before her. It was time to uncover the hidden secrets that lurked behind the clinical trials, to bring to light the overlooked narratives of her patients, and to reclaim the sanctity of her profession. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with obstacles and confrontation. But she knew there was no turning back. With newfound determination, Dr. Emily Carter prepared herself for a battle that would challenge not only her career but the very essence of medical ethics. Dr. Emily Carter was not just any young physician, she was a beacon of hope and compassion in a world often overshadowed by bureaucracy and clinical detachment. In her late 20s, with bright hazel eyes that sparkled with an unyielding passion for medicine, she had devoted her life to healing. She had grown up in a small town where community meant everything. And her parents, both educators, instilled in her a sense of empathy and the importance of advocating for those who were vulnerable. Emily's journey in medicine started at a prestigious medical school where she excelled academically. But it was her clinical rotations that truly defined her. During her time in the emergency room, she found herself drawn to the stories of her patients. Each person who walked through the door carried their own struggles, fears, and hopes. Emily learned that healing went beyond just treating physical ailments. It involved connecting with patients, understanding their backgrounds, and acknowledging their emotional and psychological needs. Her first year as a resident at City General Hospital was a whirlwind of experiences. The hospital towered over the surrounding buildings, a modern marvel of glass and steel, symbolizing cutting-edge medical advancements. Amid the bustling environment filled with nurses rushing through hallways, the sound of beeping machines, and the hushed conversations of doctors, Emily thrived. She believed in the promise of medical innovation. But she never lost sight of the human element of her practice. As she immersed herself in her work, her dedication and strong ethical backbone quickly earned her the respect of her colleagues. Dr. Carter was known for staying late, often seen working through charts and consulting with patients well after her shifts ended. Her warm demeanor made her a favorite among patients, who felt safe in her care. They opened up to her in ways they might not with others, sharing intimate details about their lives. But as she continued her residency, Emily began to notice something unsettling. It was subtle at first: discrepancies in patient records, strange notations that hinted at trials being conducted without clear consent. She dismissed it initially, chalking it up to the chaos of the hospital. However, as she delved deeper into her patients' histories, the nagging suspicions turned into a loud alarm bell. Her commitment to their well-being ran deep. She could not ignore the gnawing feeling that something was dreadfully amiss. Patients began to tell her stories of being approached for new treatments without a clear understanding of what they were signing up for. It was during a late-night shift, after comforting Mr. Thompson, an elderly man with a declining heart condition, that Emily pieced together the troubling reality. Many of her patients had unwittingly become part of clinical trials that were shrouded in secrecy and misinformation. Emily was devastated. How could this be happening in the very place that was meant to shield and heal its patients? The realization hit her hard. A wave of anger surged within her. The hospital, which she had revered as a sanctuary for healing, now appeared to be a battleground for unethical practices. Her heart raced as she wrestled with an overwhelming emotional turmoil. She was determined to unfurl the truth, but she knew that doing so would come with risks that could cost her dearly. Driven by her fierce sense of justice and an indomitable spirit, Dr. Emily Carter stood at a moral crossroads, her compassionate nature pushing her towards a fight for her patients. Even when faced with a daunting future, the stakes could not have been higher. And she knew that her next steps would define not just her career, but the very fabric of patient care in her hospital. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Dr. Emily Carter navigated the bustling hospital corridors. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the soft beeping of monitors, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and overwhelming. As a young physician at St. Jude's Medical Center, Emily was no stranger to the pressures of modern medicine. Each day brought new challenges, from efficiently juggling patient consultations to conducting rounds in the critical care unit. The hospital was not just a workplace, it was a living, breathing entity filled with hope, fear, and striving for progress. Emily's passion for patient care had led her to dedicate her life to this environment. She was known for her empathy, often spending extra time with patients to ensure they felt heard and understood. Yet, beneath her unwavering commitment lay a growing unease that started to gnaw at her conscience. The urgency of hospital politics and the relentless push for medical innovation often overshadowed the primary concern of every healthcare professional: patient well-being. As she entered the crowded waiting area, Emily noticed the diverse group of patients waiting for their appointments. Some were small children clutching stuffed animals, their eyes wide with apprehension. Others were elderly individuals, their bodies frail and battered by years of hard living. Tension hung in the air, as if the very walls of the hospital absorbed the collective anxiety and hopes of those awaiting news from their caregivers. Emily made it a point to greet each patient with a warm smile. A small gesture in a world that could feel cold and clinical. The hospital had become a cutting-edge facility, boasting the latest advancements in medical treatments and trials. Emily believed that progress was vital. But she had begun to notice the palpable pressure on her colleagues to recruit patients for these experimental treatments. Discussions about clinical trials often filled the break room, where doctors exchanged ideas and strategies as they sipped their black coffee. The expectation to contribute to the hospital's reputation and success weighed heavily on them all. Yet, amid this atmosphere of innovation, Emily began to feel a persistent doubt creeping into her mind. Was the pursuit of medical miracles coming at the expense of patient safety and informed consent? The very foundation of her medical ethics was based on the principle of do no harm. But signs of distress in her patients echoed louder every day. Questions formed in her mind like dark clouds: were they truly participants in trials? Or were they simply lab rats subjected to risks without their knowledge? Emily often found herself reflecting on her responsibility as a physician. Each patient was not just a case number but a human being with a life story, fears, and dreams. The complexity of the human experience weighed on her as she looked at those faces waiting for her to offer them hope and answers. Little did she know, the more she delved into her suspicions about the hospital's practices, the more she would uncover a reality that challenged everything she believed about patient care, ethics, and her role as a healer. Through this lens, the hospital began to shift from a place of healing to a battleground for morality, igniting a profound journey that would forever alter her understanding of what it meant to be a doctor. Dr. Emily Carter was wrapping up her rounds when a peculiar pattern in her patients' medical records caught her attention. It was subtle at first, a few odd notations that seemed out of place. She noticed that several of her patients had been treated with a new experimental medication, but there were no notes indicating their informed consent or even the standard pre-treatment evaluations required by the Medical Ethics Board. Curiosity piqued. She leaned into her computer screen, scrolling through the files while her heart raced. The first case she scrutinized belonged to Mrs. Thompson, a sweet, elderly woman with a history of heart disease. Dr. Carter had been treating her for months, but her recent record indicated a switch to an experimental drug labeled Trial Med X without any prior discussion. Deeply concerned, Emily grabbed a printed copy of Mrs. Thompson's file and headed straight to her bedside. With a calm and reassuring demeanor, she introduced herself and gently began to probe. "Mrs. Thompson," she began, "I wanted to talk to you about your treatment. I see here that there's been a change in your medication. Have you had a chance to discuss this with anyone?" Mrs. Thompson looked confused, her eyes blinking slowly as she processed the information. "Oh, dear? I thought it was just a regular medication. Nobody said anything to me about it being a trial." Dr. Carter's stomach twisted with concern. This wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson, It was a potential pattern of negligence that seemed to pervade the entire hospital. Over the next few days, she dug deeper into the records of her other patients. The discoveries were increasingly alarming. 2 additional patients, Mr. Hargrove and Ms. Chang, had unknowingly been enrolled in the same drug trial. None of them fully informed about the possible risks or side effects. With each file she reviewed, the weight of her findings sank deeper into her conscience. It became evident that a darker truth was unraveling before her eyes. The hospital was conducting these clinical trials without adhering to the ethical standards that defined their profession. The urgency to act grew more intense as Emily reflected on her oath to do no harm. She felt it was her responsibility to protect her patients from becoming mere subjects for a pharmaceutical company's bottom line. But how to approach this situation? Dr. Carter wrestled with her thoughts, envisioning the consequences that might follow her pursuit of the truth. She recalled her MD ethics course, where the potential for ethical breach was emphasized. But this scenario felt raw and terrifyingly real. Would her superiors support her? Or would they retaliate against her whistleblowing? Yet, doubt served as a catalyst for determination. Dr. Carter vowed to uncover the full extent of the malpractice. She started gathering evidence discreetly, compiling testimonies from her unwitting patients, keeping meticulous notes of each discrepancy she found, and forming a cohesive narrative that illustrated the hospital's disregard for patient rights. As she immersed herself in her investigation, principles of medical integrity and the sanctity of patient care responsibilities echoed in her mind. Dr. Carter knew that she could not remain passive in the face of such injustice. Every heartbeat of hope pulsated in tandem with her desire to advocate for those who had been turned into lab rats rather than treated with the dignity they deserved. It was only a matter of time before she reported her findings to the right authorities. But the fear of retaliation loomed like a dark cloud overhead. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainties. But her commitment to investigating the truth left no room for complacency. Dr. Emily Carter stood in the sterile confines of her hospital room, the fluorescent lights above buzzing softly as shadows danced across the walls. Her heart raced as she rifled through her patients' medical records once more, a disquieting feeling knotting in her stomach. Over the past few days, an unsettling pattern had emerged, entries that seemed incongruous with her patients' conditions. It was as if they were being treated not for their ailments, but rather as subjects in a grand experiment. The thought sent a chill down her spine. A sense of dread loomed over her as she faced the reality of what this could mean. Sloppy documentation, or something more sinister. As she flipped through the pages, she couldn't shake the feeling that a boundary was being crossed, one that seemed to blur the lines between treatment and exploitation. Each name on the list represented a life, a family, and dreams yet to be fulfilled. And yet here they were, reduced to mere data points within a clinical trial system she had dedicated her life to fighting for. This wasn't the intention of her medical career. With each passing day, the weight of the discovery grew heavier on her shoulders. The ethical dilemma trapped her in a relentless storm of conflicting duties. On one side, her oath to prioritize the well-being of her patients, and on the other, the potential repercussions of exposing the truth. Dr. Carter's mind raced with what-ifs. What if she brought this to light and faced retaliation from her superiors? What if her career, which she had worked so hard to build, crumbled now? The hospital environment, once a nurturing haven for healing, seemed fraught with danger. Each smile she exchanged with her colleagues felt like an unspoken challenge, a reminder that trust was a commodity easily broken. Just last week, She had walked by the break room and overheard hushed conversations among the senior doctors, discussions about the need for more subjects for the trials, laced with urgency that felt unsettlingly amiss. Were these truly innovative treatments, or mere desperation masked as progress? As she stared at the patient file in front of her, the face of each person she cared for swam before her eyes. There was Jenny, a mother of 3 battling severe depression; Carlos, a former athlete now navigating the debilitating aftermath of a life-altering accident; and Mr. Thompson, the jovial retiree with stories of his adventures, each one relying on her to advocate for their health while navigating an increasingly complicated system. She felt more like a cog in a wheel that spun without regard for the lives it touched. The passion that had initially drawn her to medicine felt like a fading ember against the backdrop of ethical treachery. Setting aside her personal fears, she resolved to delve deeper into this darkness. The violation of patient consent was not just a whisper of wrongdoing, it was a thunderous call to action. She would fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, even if it meant risking everything. But the question lingered: would her challenge against the establishment lead to a beacon of hope or sink her further into despair? Dr. Emily Carter knew the risks that lay ahead. Yet her commitment to her patients burned brighter than her fears. She took a deep breath, prepared to embark on a path fraught with uncertainty, knowing that standing up for what was right, no matter the personal cost, was a battle worth fighting. Dr. Emily Carter knew that uncovering the truth behind the clinical trials would not be easy. With a heavy heart and a mind brimming with questions, she began her covert investigation, knowing that the stakes were high. Each day after her shifts in the hospital, she would stay late to comb through patient files, worry weighing down her conscience as she wrestled with the moral implications of what she might find. Her first step was to talk to some of the patients she suspected were part of the unauthorized trials. She chose to approach them casually, presenting her inquiries under the guise of routine checkups. "How have you been feeling lately?" she would ask gently, trying to elicit any information about their treatments that could raise red flags. One evening, during a routine visit with Mr. Thompson, an elderly patient suffering from chronic pain, Emily sensed a deeper unease. Mr. Thompson spoke of new medications he was trying, but he hesitated when asked if he understood the risks involved. "No one ever really explained it to me, Doc. I just signed where they told me to," he admitted with a furrowed brow. Emily felt a knot tightening in her stomach. His words echoed the concerns she had when looking through the records. The lack of informed consent for patients was not just a bureaucratic failure, it was a betrayal of their trust. With each patient she spoke to, the pieces of a troubling puzzle began to fit together. There was a pattern among them: all had been given experimental drugs, medications still awaiting official approval. Yet here they were, systematically distributed under the guise of routine care. Emily began jotting down notes, creating a timeline, and mapping the patient's experiences against the treatments they received. She felt like an investigative journalist, unraveling a narrative hidden beneath the sterile facades of the hospital corridors. As she delved deeper, Emily uncovered more alarming discrepancies in the hospital's practices. During her free evenings, she scoured online databases and medical journals, learning about the ethical guidelines governing clinical trials, emphasizing the need for informed patient consent, a principle the hospital clearly flouted. Fueled by righteous anger, she reached out to former employees and whistleblowers online, gathering testimony and evidence of the behind-the-scenes machinations that shrouded the hospital's operations. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's commitment only strengthened. She found herself driven by a deeper purpose. the faces and stories of her patients haunting her thoughts. Patients like Sarah, a single mother battling breast cancer, who had been pivoted into testing without full knowledge of what the drugs entailed. Or Martinez, a young man struggling with depression, who had unknowingly participated in an experimental trial that seemed to exacerbate, rather than alleviate, his symptoms. As she connected with these patients, Emily felt an urgency to confront the reality of their suffering. It was not enough to gather information, she craved action. She had to break through the barriers of silence and stigma, risking everything to ensure that those who had been victimized would no longer be mere subjects in a cruel experiment. With a determined heart propelling her forward, she prepared herself to take her findings to the higher-ups, bracing for the inevitable storm that would follow. Little did Emily know that standing on the precipice of fear and courage would change the course of her life forever, testifying for those who had become invisible in the shadows of the hospital's greed. As the walls closed in, the weight of the truths she had uncovered began to empower her, transforming her from a passive observer into a fierce advocate for her patients. The journey was fraught with challenges, but Emily steeled herself for the conflicts ahead, unwilling to let her patients down any longer. Dr. Emily Carter stood outside the sleek, glass-paneled office of the hospital's chief administrator, her heart pounding in her chest. The realization that her findings could rattle the very foundations of the institution she revered filled her with a mix of dread and determination. Having gathered irrefutable evidence of unauthorized clinical trials, she knew that confronting the hierarchy would not only jeopardize her career but also put her integrity to the ultimate test. After taking a moment to collect her thoughts, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was immaculate, adorned with certificates and accolades that spoke to the hospital's storied history. The administrator, Mr. Thomas Chen, looked up from his desk, his expression a blend of curiosity and annoyance. "Dr. Carter, what brings you here? Thank you for seeing me. Mr. Chen? I need to discuss something serious," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, as she explained the discrepancies she had unearthed in patient records. She noticed his demeanor shift. The initially calm facade hardened, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "Are you suggesting that the hospital is conducting illicit trials? That's a grave accusation, Dr. Carter," he replied, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I have proof," she insisted, urgency creeping into her voice. "Patients were enrolled in trials without their consent. Their health and well-being are at stake." Mr. Chen's expression darkened. "You should be cautious with your words. There are protocols in place. And just because you don't have all the facts doesn't mean you should jump to conclusions." Emily felt a flush of anger surface. "These are patients' lives we're talking about. They deserve transparency, not secrecy. This isn't just about protocols, it's about ethics and the trust they place in us as medical professionals." For a moment, silence enveloped the room. Emily held his gaze, refusing to back down. The air was thick with tension, the stakes undeniably high. Mr. Chen finally broke the silence. "Dr. Carter, I understand your concern, but our hospital has been under immense pressure to deliver innovative treatments. The advances in medicine require risks but must be handled with care. Risks should not come at the cost of patient autonomy. You're using vulnerable individuals as test subjects." She shot back, fueled by both fear and fury. As the conversation escalated, Emily realized the implications of her fight. The system that was meant to protect patients had become a machine that prioritized results over ethics. As Mr. Chen maintained his firm stance against her accusations, she knew she had to dig deeper. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a call to action. If you refuse to take this seriously, I will have no choice but to escalate this issue to the medical board, she declared. Her voice resolute. Mr. Chen's gaze narrowed. Calculating the move. You're taking a big risk. Dr. Carter. Are you prepared for the consequences? With a steady resolve, she replied. I'm prepared to fight for my patients. Their health and rights matter more than your reputation. The confrontation was not just a clash of wills, it was a watershed moment for Emily. As she left his office, she understood that the battle for ethical medical practices was just beginning. Armed with her evidence and unyielding determination, she would shine a light on the dark corners of the healthcare system, no matter the personal cost. As Dr. Emily Carter delved deeper into her investigation, she began to connect with some of the patients whose records raised her suspicions. Each story unfolded like a chapter in a tragic novel, revealing the sometimes harrowing reality of people who had placed their trust in the healthcare system that was supposed to protect them. One of the first patients she spoke with was Mrs. Linda Hayes, a grandmother who had been admitted to the hospital for routine surgery. Linda was bubbly, with a warmth that made you feel at home. During their conversation, however, Dr. Carter noticed the shadows of fear lurking in Linda's cheerful demeanor. I just don't feel right about what they insist I participate in, Linda confided, her hands trembling as she gripped the blanket covering her legs. I signed a form, but they didn't even explain what these trials were about. All I wanted was to get better. Linda's experience was only the tip of the iceberg. As Dr. Carter continued her interviews, she came across a series of heartbreaking testimonies. There was Mark, a young father of two who had been suffering from chronic pain due to a workplace accident. He had been enrolled in a trial for a new pain management drug. I felt like a guinea pig, he lamented, staring blankly at the floor. This medication gave me side effects worse than what I was already dealing with. And I never agreed to this. Mark's desperation was palpable, echoed through the singular hope for a better life and the deep disappointment of betrayal by a system he thought was in his corner. Then there was Susan, a single mother in her early 30s, battling cancer. She nervously recounted her treatment process, revealing that she had unknowingly been part of a clinical trial while being treated for her condition. I just wanted to fight for my life, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When I found out that they didn't even tell me I was part of an experiment, it felt like my life was a game to them. Her emotional turmoil and fear of the unknown resonated with Dr. Carter, fueling her fire to uncover the truth. The stories flooded in, each showcasing the nuances of human experience and the critical need for informed consent in healthcare. They revealed the raw vulnerability of patients seeking hope in a system designed to heal them, only to find themselves caught in a web of unethical practices. Each narrative was not just a statistic, they were the voices that needed to be heard, the concerns that highlighted the urgent need for transparency and ethical conduct in medical trials. Dr. Carter was overwhelmed by the collective impact of these stories. The faces of each patient haunted her, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The gravity of her findings became clearer with every patient she spoke to. She realized that this was not just a professional obligation but a moral crusade to undo the injustices that had been committed against vulnerable individuals seeking care. Their strength in the face of adversity inspired her. She knew she had to advocate for them. Each patient's plight knit itself into a tapestry of solidarity. compelling her to take action not just for them but for a healthcare system that had strayed from its ethical compass. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, the day of reckoning arrived for Dr. Emily Carter. With a heart full of resolve and a mind racing with questions, she stood at the podium during the hospital's board meeting. Clutching the meticulously compiled evidence she had gathered over the past few weeks. The room was filled with the senior administrators, seasoned doctors, and a gallery of nurses, each face a mask of professionalism. But behind their calm exteriors, she sensed a wave of brewing tension. They had no idea what was about to transpire. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "I stand before you today not just as a doctor, but as an advocate for our patients, individuals who have entrusted their lives to us. In my research, I uncovered grave misconduct within our hospital. Practices involving clinical trials conducted without proper consent from our patients." A murmur rippled through the audience as she unveiled her evidence, emails, records, and testimonies she had painstakingly gathered and compiled. Each piece of paper represented a life. A story filled with aspirations, fears, and trust that had been violated. "I have spoken to many patients who were unaware they were part of these trials, who suffered side effects and sometimes serious health issues because they were treated not as patients, but as mere experiments." Dr. Carter's heart raced as she directly faced her superiors. "I understand the pressure we are under to innovate and advance in medicine. But it should never come at the cost of ethical standards and human decency. We must ensure that our patients are informed, consenting participants in their treatment. Anything less is a betrayal of our oath as healers." As her words hung in the air, she could see the effects of her revelations starting to take root. Some faces were flushed with indignation, while others exhibited signs of guilt, a silent admission of the lapses that had been allowed to proliferate under the guise of progress. At last, Dr. Carter's brave stance acted like a catalyst. The head administrator finally broke the silence. "Dr. Carter, your findings warrant an immediate investigation. We cannot ignore the truth any longer. Our patients' rights must come first." The room collectively gasped, caught off guard by the sudden shift in authority. She felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. In the weeks that followed, the hospital launched a thorough investigation into the clinical trial practices. The fallout was significant. Several senior administrators resigned or faced disciplinary action, and new policies were put into place that mandated strict adherence to ethical standards in patient care and research practices. Dr. Carter was appointed to a new ethics board that would oversee all clinical trials in the hospital, actively engaging in creating a transparent and accountable environment that ensured patient safety and informed consent. The culmination of her efforts redefined the way the hospital operated, turning a shadowy corner into the light of accountability and integrity. Patients were treated with respect and autonomy. And Dr. Carter found fulfillment in knowing she had not only fought for her patients but had inspired a movement toward compassion in healthcare. Reflecting on her journey, Dr. Carter felt a profound sense of purpose. Her fight had not just transformed her hospital's practices, it created ripples of change that extended beyond its walls. Together with her colleagues, she became a beacon of ethical responsibility, ensuring that every patient was treated with the dignity they deserved. She had stood up for what was right, illustrating that courage in the face of adversity could lead to a brighter, more humane future in medicine. As Dr. Emily Carter sat in her dimly lit office, her mind raced with the implications of everything she had uncovered. The weight of her findings hung heavy on her shoulders, a burden only she knew how to carry. The stories of her patients, the single mother working 2 jobs to support her children, the elderly man fighting against the odds, and the young woman struggling with a terminal illness, pulsated in her thoughts. Each faced their own battles, unaware of the role they had unwittingly been cast in. In the weeks following her confrontation with hospital authorities, changes had begun to ripple through the institution. Dr. Carter had stood her ground, advocating passionately for the patients who had entrusted their lives to her care. The investigations, sparked by her courageous revelations, brought to light a dark underbelly of the healthcare system, the unethical practice of conducting clinical trials without informed consent. After months of pressure and public outcry, the hospital was forced to reevaluate its protocol. And a chain reaction began that would touch hospitals across the nation. Yet, as much as she reveled in the victory of justice, Emily understood that this was only the beginning. During her investigation, she had witnessed firsthand the desperation of patients to cling to hope, exploiting their vulnerabilities and dreams for the sake of profit and expediency. The striking realization that the system built to heal often operated with alarming opacity weighed heavily on her. And as she continued to practice medicine, she vowed never to allow her patients to feel like mere cogs in a machine again. In the wake of ethical reforms, Emily took personal responsibility for educating her patients. She initiated workshops to explain what clinical trials entailed, helping them understand their rights as patients. With every session, the hospital began to foster a culture of transparency. Doctors became advocates for their patients, holding firm against the pressure to cut corners in the name of progress. The profound lesson she learned extended beyond the hospital's walls. It spilled into the community, igniting conversations about the importance of informed consent and patient rights. Patients were no longer silent, they raised their voices, demanding transparency and accountability from those they entrusted their lives to. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, Emily reflected on her journey. She knew the fight for ethical practices would continue, but the seeds of change had been planted. In an era where progress in medicine is often touted, it was her mission to ensure that human dignity was not sacrificed in the name of innovation. Remember, she often told her patients, your voice matters. You have the right to ask questions, to seek clarity, and to demand respect in your healthcare journey. And as she looked towards the future, Dr. Carter hoped her story would inspire others to reflect on the hidden realities within the medical system. If you found this story thought-provoking, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more engaging stories that explore the pressing social issues we face today. Together, we can continue to advocate for transparency and ethical practices in healthcare. Thank you for being part of this important conversation.